Hello everyone, and welcome to this event presented by the Wheeler Centre, Amnesty International and Free Media Myanmar. I'm Zoe Daniel and I'll be your host today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the land of the Kulin Nation and that I sit on unceded Boon Wurrung country. I pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to the elders of all communities this conversation reaches. In the months since February's coup in Myanmar, media freedoms have been inexorably tightened. Once again, independent media outlets have had their licences revoked, and journalists and citizens are at risk of arrest and imprisonment for gathering and distributing news. With the deliberate disruption of Wi-Fi and mobile data services, it's been increasingly difficult for citizen journalists to use social media to tell the story of what's happening inside the country. Together with the expected decrease in international media attention amid a 24-hour news cycle defined by short attention spans, state-sponsored violence, repression and coercion are now barely being reported. Today, we will seek to shed light on what is actually going on and ask what role independent media plays in Myanmar and how we can best support that. On our panel today, we're joined by Swe Win, the editor-in-chief at Myanmar Now, an independent news agency that produces features and investigations in both Burmese and English. Swe Win was a political prisoner for 7 years during the military regime and is currently running Myanmar Now from Australia in effective exile. Michelle Aung Thin is an academic and writer. She was born in Rangoon, grew up in Canada, and currently teaches in the School of Media and Communication at RMIT University in Melbourne. Michelle's written several novels set in Myanmar. And Professor Peter Greste, journalist and media freedom activist and academic. He's a founding member of the advocacy group, the Alliance for Journalists' Freedom, and the UNESCO Chair in Journalism and Communication at the University of Queensland. Welcome so much to the three of you. Swe Win, I'll begin with you. Could you paint a picture of the current situation in Myanmar for journalists?
This is the worst situation for media professionals since the country opened up to a bit of democracy since 2011. We can say that we are now back under the old military era between 1962 and 2010. We are back to square one. For example, now no reporter can go and gather any sort of news on the street. Nobody is allowed to hold any sort of camera. And then the soldiers and the security forces would set at checkpoints without any notice at any corner of the street, and they would examine your mobile phones, your Facebook accounts, and then if they find any picture or photograph of soldiers or protests or any symbol of resistance movement, it's very likely that you will be arrested there and then. And if unfortunately you will be charged with the law, you will face concorded charges of posing national security threat. So this is the situation. There is no space left at all for professional media or for any kind of freedom of expression or freedom of press, I would say.
So are journalists working at all? And if they are, how?
Yeah, actually, all the journalists who have decided to continue working in the country, they are working as sort of underground operators, I would say, actually. They are not working in any conventional sense of journalism, actually, or journalist work. So, for example, they will go and see something for themselves actually, and then they will pass the information to their fellow journalists who are living outside the control of the junta actually, So that's the situation actually, and then we will use newly developed mobile applications by which they can securely transfer and store all the visual work, that sort of thing actually, But they are living in a state of constant anxiety and fear actually, because now the junta is tightening the noose, I will say actually, even though people might have an impression that the country is in a very volatile situation, amid daily outbreaks of violence, amid daily attacks on the security forces by resistant movement actually, or fighters, I would say actually. People think that the junta is not able to control the country. Yes, it is not able to control, but I would say it is increasingly capable of tightening the control. For example, now there are a lot of nightly checks actually by the security forces. We call gas registration. Anyone, anyone staying overnight is now required to report to the authorities. You have to provide all your details actually. So many journalists actually, they are hiding in many different places actually. So it's now very difficult for them, to keep doing their work. I asking all my colleagues actually, some of the colleagues who decided to remain in the country, you are allowed to come out. You are encouraged to come out, of the country. I will continue to hire more journalists who are not affiliated, publicly affiliated with my organization, for example, to continue my work. But anyone who has been known to be working actually for Myanmar Now actually, I encourage them to leave the country. But they have their own problems actually, and also they have they are feeling guilty actually. They are abandoning the country when young people between the ages of 20 and I would say 25 are taking their risks. Taking all the risks actually to fight against the military coup, to fight against the military establishment. So it's very psychologically uncomfortable for many people to abandon the country, I would say.
Incredibly high pressure environment, and as you say, certainly a return to the bad old days, which is also incredibly sad. Michelle Aung Thin, I'm curious what contact you're having with colleagues, friends, family in Myanmar, and what you would say about the limited picture that we are getting from media coverage and how that compares to day-to-day life.
One of the things that has really been a huge issue in country is COVID, and that's been weaponized effectively against people. So that means people can't continue their work as writers. Most of my colleagues are artists, writers, and kind of media people, creative people. So it's really difficult to continue under those conditions where things are locked down and people are staying in their homes. Many people I know have actually left the country, like Swe Win has said, and they're out of country and kind of looking back in. There's a really strong creativity to the CDM movement and a kind of real sense of self-expression and very creative ways of kind of expressing displeasure. For example, women used their longees at one point as a kind of barrier for soldiers not to go under. And there's been lots of beautiful Instagrammable, really visually appealing styles of protest specifically to get the message out there in a very kind of clever way. But that, of course, has really been pushed back because, the internet is cut. So people are finding it very difficult. There is such widespread determination, however, and such such support for democracy, it's just very difficult to be able to express that at the moment.
Yeah, and I want to unpack a couple of things there. One is COVID. Can you just sort of explain to those who might not know just how difficult it is, for example, to get medical attention currently? A lot of doctors went underground after the coup, of course, and as you say, with COVID sort of being weaponized in a way, you have a lot of people who are not only trying to get information out, but who are actually sick with COVID who need healthcare. So there's a huge backdrop of difficulty in this environment in layers, isn't there?
Absolutely. So my contacts are mainly people who speak English, and so they've had a certain level of, access to international connections. They're relatively well off. And so what they've had to do, and I can only really speak to the specific experiences of people I know, is they've had to, first of all, find doctors who will see them. They've had to source oxygen. They've had to source any kind of medical care. And usually when you source one source for oxygen, that's never enough. You have to have backups. Money, it's trying to get money in and out of the country is more difficult, and people are relying on that external money to kind of pay for their doctor's bills. Then there's also a layer of bureaucracy as well. So if somebody does die, you then have to kind of negotiate a permit for burial, and that can take a long time. So on many, many levels, it's really, really difficult to actually get the care you need, get the resources you need. And then, of course, things as simple as paracetamol are suddenly incredibly expensive, like 10 times, 20 times what they once were. So even very basic medicines are hard to get. On Facebook, on the internet, a lot of the chat groups are talking around more kind of herbal medicines, just, what you can kind of get around you as a kind of panacea, but the situation's not good. And that's amongst people who are very well healed, very well connected, and very well resourced. For people who aren't, who don't have that kind of sense of confidence to even face authority, I think, life is pretty grim. It's a very shocking thing to do to your own people, to use the pandemic in that way.
I want to go to national unity in Myanmar with you briefly, Michelle, before I go to Peter. To what degree do you think that the most recent crisis, if I could call it that, has united people in the country more than ever before?
Do you mean the declaration of war? Yeah? Okay,
yeah.
So it's a really interesting thing. As Swe Win says, this is very much something that's been carried forward by young people. The 1988 generation. So there's been three coups in Myanmar, one in 1962, one in 1988, and then one this year's coup. And so the 1988 generation carries a lot of gravitas in the country, and they were very much linked with the NLD and the CDM movement. But really, there's been such an incredible youth movement around it that has been around, the whole social media exposure and thinking in a really different way. And I think a lot of young people are quite frustrated from what I hear. And so a lot of them are actually joining these militia forces. So in terms of the unity in the country, I think it's a real step. But I do think there's such pent-up frustration that perhaps this is a move that is going to, people are going to have to ask what they actually want. And increasingly, since the beginning, people have been calling this a revolution rather, as well as a kind of protest movement. So I think we're at that moment of what actually is going to happen next. I'm sure Swe Win will have more to say about this, though.
Yeah, Swe Win, I will come back to you to ask, given the impact of the colonial period on modern day Myanmar that continues, does that create a responsibility for countries like the UK, Australia, the US to participate in trying to bring about democracy in Myanmar, or should we actually stay out of it?
I don't see that way actually. I don't. Many people are not feeling that way as well actually. We don't view that former colonial, a colonial government, for example, UK has the responsibility, actually, to come to our rescue, that sort of thing, actually, So we are trying to get rid of all these, colonial uh, colonial link, actually, as much as possible, because the history of colonialism has been much exploited, actually, by successive military junta, actually, to project their power, to project their uh, their their predominance in the society, actually, So we nobody, as far as I know, is not viewing that the Western powers have the responsibility, or at least have the moral responsibility, to come to our way. We had a lot of expectations, from the international community and from the West, not because they used to rule our country, they used to rule Asia or colonize Asia or Africa, just because we have the share, values, actually, just because these countries have sort of proper democracy, democratic rights in place, etc. Actually, that's why we look to them, not because they have to do something for their history, actually, with Asia or etc. Actually.
Yeah, and it's a perfect lead in to you, Peter Greste. Like me, you have been a foreign correspondent reporting in and on countries with very complex histories. And I feel like, in terms of media coverage, we have a sort of a two-track conversation here. One is about helping facilitate and foster Myanmar media, and the other is about the role, if any, foreign media has in trying to cover what's happening in Myanmar. What role do you think the foreign media has, particularly in this difficult environment that Swe Win's described, of people getting in and out and actually doing the work?
Well, this is one of those situations where we've really got no choice but to rely on the locals. It's always a difficult relationship, and particularly when you're putting locals at risk by asking them to go out and get information for you as foreign journalists. But I also believe that the foreign media has an urgent responsibility to keep this story on the front pages. As Swe Win mentioned, the West, or the international community, has a responsibility here to apply pressure, not from a colonialist perspective, but just from a diplomatic perspective. We know that the government, the junta, is sensitive to international opinion. I was talking to a while ago to Nathan Wang from Come Out Media, who was released after he was arrested alongside his colleague Han Thin. And Han Thin is still imprisoned. He's still been, as far as we know, he's been tortured and abused quite extensively. Nathan is convinced that the only reason he was released is because he is a US citizen, and the Americans put a great deal of pressure on the junta to let him go. So we know that international attention, we know that international pressure works. Foreign governments are only going to keep up that pressure if there is domestic political pressure, and that's only going to come from active international reporting on what's taking place inside Myanmar. Of course, without direct access, it's very, very difficult to keep those stories alive, and so that's why we increasingly are going to fall back on local journalists, on the citizen journalists, to keep up that flow of information. I think the big responsibility that international news organizations have, though, is to keep supporting those local journalists with resources, with finances. That's the only way we're going to be able to keep this going.
I'm interested in to what degree you think the Australian government remains engaged with this issue. I mentioned in my introduction a 24-hour news cycle and the short public attention span, government attention spans perhaps are slightly longer behind the scenes, but with competing priorities, particularly in an environment of COVID, it is difficult to keep this front of mind. What do you think's going on there?
Well, I've been speaking to DFAT over these issues, and DFAT insists that it is actively engaged in trying to put pressure on the government. I can at their word, we haven't seen a great deal of public attention placed on this. We haven't seen them speaking out publicly. They insist that they're doing this because they see that diplomacy is more effective if it's done quietly. The situation for Australia, of course, is complicated a little bit because one of our nationals is still in detention, and the Australian government is also trying to get him out. But I also, in my own experience in Egypt, when I was arrested in Egypt, I realised that again I was released only because of a very loud public pressure that gave the politicians and the diplomats the political license, the political credibility, if you like, and the political pressure to speak up and speak very, very vocally. And I think that even though the diplomat's first instinct is to go for quiet diplomacy, I really do believe that this is we're only going to see the movement that we really need. We're only going to see the diplomatic pressure that we need if there is loud and sustained public pressure as well.
So I'm told that getting financial support into Myanmar right now is very difficult. Can you speak to what that process looks like? And if that is the case, what can we be doing to try to support journalists on the ground?
Yeah. There are a number of newsrooms whose license were revoked, and many of them still retain their own journalists on the ground. So now there are a number of international organizations supporting these media who are in difficulties, including Myanmar Now, which I work for. So by directly supporting those newsrooms, actually, you can support, the journalists on the ground. That may not be true, actually, in all circumstances. There are also a number of freelancers working for local outlets and international outlets as well. So I'm not sure how we can support them, in this kind of situation. But for established outlets, if you directly support these established outlets, then you are supporting the journalists on the ground. For example, there are a lot of unpredictable costs actually. You cannot calculate the cost. You cannot calculate. The cost of which you cannot anticipate actually because people are on the move. We are also using unconventional methods of news gathering, which I should not speak about in public actually. So there are many things actually. You just create things in times of difficulties actually. So there are a number of things we are trying to develop. So yeah, there are a lot of costs actually on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, it takes my mind back to several countries that I've worked in when I haven't meant to be there, or I haven't been meant to be there, with local journalists, and the ways that we found ways around the rules by doing things covertly and moving material in and out of the country in ways that you might not expect. As you say, with a lot of journalists having moved outside the borders and therefore helping facilitate from those who are still working inside. So, for the non-media audience that is watching this, there are ways and means of doing it, but obviously the approach is incredibly high risk for the local people who are involved in that in the circumstances. Michelle, I'm interested in, from your conversations with those inside, what degree of motivation there is to get these stories out, and is there an understanding at all of what we're seeing outside Myanmar, do you think?
Do you mean how do people understand world attention to what's going on in country? Well, I think the hope is to be seen. I think that's a really important thing for people. And people, as I know, continue to try to push things out. You know, they try to put art out there, or they try to put video campaigns out there. So there is still that determination. It's just very, very difficult because, of course, people rely on things like the internet to get things out. And then I think, you know, one of the things that is very concerning is that because it's so difficult to get money in and because so many things have been sort of shut down, food security is becoming more and more of a problem. And so I think the day-to-day just kind of getting by is really difficult for people. So, you know, the determination is definitely there. And I think the desire to be seen is really huge. It's just whether people can monitor that in country, I'm not sure how much they can kind of get from that. Maybe from family rather than from, you know, consuming media internally.
Yeah, I mean, you make a great point about the difficulty of daily life balanced with trying to tell a story. You know, when you're battling every day to get fuel, food, not get arrested, and merely survive, and then at the same time sort of motivated by this idea of trying to get information out of the country so other people can understand that. I mean, it's hugely pressurized competing interests there.
Yeah, I think so. I think people must be tired, must be tired by now. Yeah.
Well, and especially given the history, given that, okay, young people have experienced substantial freedom in the last, let's say, 15 years, perhaps, but there'll be very deep memories of life before for many who are experiencing that again. That must be doubly exhausting.
I think so. Actually, that probably is one of the great impetuses behind the protest movement. People feel that there is no sense of a future, that, you know, they're in this kind of time loop going back to the way things were, the times of censorship. I remember colleagues, you know, really early in the sort of 2010s, like just around 2013 and 14, poets and writers saying they really didn't know how to write without a kind of self-censorship kicking in automatically. They didn't really know how to express themselves freely. They weren't really sure what to make of the kind of rapid changes. And, you know, that generation's experience, I think, really does inform people who are very young, who are used to just kind of letting it all hang out and kind of expressing themselves more freely. So there is so much at stake in terms of that kind of intellectual freedom and that sense of freedom and a sense of kind of self-determination. So I think that is definitely a strong motivator, just a sense that there is a future, especially for young people.
Yeah, I mean, just from my observations of traveling in Myanmar, and it is some time ago now, after particularly in sort of between 2010 and 2014, the artists played a huge role in the lead up to that period, in poetry, in music, in theatre, in visual art. So it's a real, well, not only a legacy, but a deep thread, I feel, in Myanmar that I found was unique to the countries in Southeast Asia from my observation.
Oh, yeah, it's a very, well, it was a very vibrant scene. Every time I've been there, there's been so much going on. There, you know, there's famous people who, when the junta banned the color red, only painted in red. And, you know, it's one of the places on the planet where it's very cool to be a poet, right? Being a poet is an amazing, you know, a cultural high. And the poets are people who've actually borne the brunt. 3 of them have been killed. One of them was kidnapped and tortured and murdered. And yet, you know, these are the people who feel it's important to speak out and can speak out in ways that are, you know, slightly different from, say, reporting and journalism, you know, speaking from the heart, if you like. Yeah, it's a very, that moment when censorship lifted and those ensuing years, they were incredibly rich for the artistic community there, you know, really trying to make sense of what had happened and what it means to be able to express yourself freely.
Yeah,
I think that still exists.
I recall being on the street, yeah, which is great. I mean, I recall being on the street after the NLD was elected and Aung San Suu Kyi was put into parliament, and there were literally people free rapping on the street, and tens of thousands of people on the street in Yangon celebrating in that way, like this spilling over of sort of ecstasy. But the artists were so prominent in that happy moment, and for me, much as I'm moderating this panel, this is one of the reasons that that was such a joyous time to spend time in a country that was opening up. That's why this is so difficult to watch. Michelle, I'm wondering about the unity that we were talking about earlier, and just how sustainable that is under such sort of sustained attack by the Tatmadaw on multiple fronts. Divide and conquer is a very traditional method of fragmenting nations. Is it going to be hard for people to stick together under that pressure?
Well, I think one of the things that has surprised me is how the Tatmadaw have actually politicized people who are very kind of middle class, not particularly political at all. And so that is a really interesting phenomenon. Also, there's, the National Unity Government has really made an effort, I think, to kind of include ethnicities. And so, in a sense, maybe that is something that's going to help, this idea that, there's a real kind of force to kind of push back against. But who knows, with things like food insecurity and, the rise of COVID, those are huge pressures. And if you don't feel seen, I think it will be difficult to kind of keep that momentum going.
Yeah, so Swe Win, to come back to you on that, I feel from a lot of the coverage that we're seeing, it's very much confined to protests, violence, and that sort of analysis of life in Myanmar. Obviously, we're not seeing that because that's really difficult to source. What are we missing? I mean, I worry with everything that Michelle has said about COVID and getting access to medicine and stuff like that. The oversight of what's going on is so limited. What's happening with the Rohingya, for example, I feel like that's just a black spot for the international community. How do you, as someone who's leading a media organisation, try to drill down with all the obstacles that you're facing?
Yeah, what are we missing in our coverage? Actually, you are right. Actually, we have no choice but to focus all our attention on the day-to-day, life and death, events. Actually, incidents. So there are a lot of areas actually which we are missing. For example, you're right. Actually, regarding the plight of the Rohingya community and also the plight of the hundreds or thousands of war refugees actually in Shan State and also in Kachin State in the north of the country, in the east of the country, etc. And also our coverage is not reflected of the enormous difficulties for people to survive actually. For example, Michelle has talked about a little bit actually. For example, many people die actually, just at the entrance of the hospital during the peak of the COVID actually in June and July actually, etc. So there are many people who are now very worried about just food actually, just the food security actually, how to get food, etc. So also the situation is complex and complicated than we are reporting. For example, the National Unity Government is trying to wage a resistant war against the junta, but there are a lot of complexities. There are a lot of, I would say, a lot of things that uh, which made them very incoherent in their strategy actually. There is a lot of incoordination actually, within this resistance movement. And also, even though the national unity actually, has dramatically increased. There is a sort of consensus, actually, among the Burmese majority and also among the ethnic groups, not just ordinary citizens, but also between the NAD and also between the ethnic groups. There is a consensus that we have to fight, collectively against the junta. But still, there are suspicions, actually. There are doubts. For example, there is a view that the national unity government is not, actually, not doing enough, actually, to build alliances, with the ethnic groups, etc. Actually, they are trying to manipulate, they are trying to monopolize, actually, this resistance movement, all these sort of things. Not just that, there is also geopolitical factor. For example, the major groups in the Shan state, in the Kachin state, they have to calculate, actually, about the China factor, actually, how their cooperation with the resistance movement will impact their relationship with China, etc. All these things, actually, make things complicated. We are not able to report all these complexities.
I don't envy the job that you have, Swe Win. It's incredibly challenging. And you know what? I mean, I'd like you to tell everyone how it came about that you came to Australia. I think it's illustrative of, even though it was some time ago, the sorts of situations that media and journalists face. How did you come to be here?
First, I don't want to live outside the country, actually. I live 7 years in prison. So I was jailed at the age of 20, and then I came out, actually, at the age of 27. So I missed a lot of things, actually. I missed a lot of information. I missed a lot of various aspects of the society, even though Myanmar was, caught in a time warp, actually. So it's difficult for me, actually, to adapt my life, actually, to the outside world, So I left the country briefly, actually, for about 2 or 3 years. There are many things I like, and also there are things, actually, I cannot come to terms with psychologically and culturally, actually, And then I enjoy, actually, I enjoy my freedom within the past 10 or 15 years, actually, So I enjoy a lot, actually, I enjoy the culture, I enjoy the freedom to write many things, many various things. For example, I spent a few years, actually, researching, investigating about the prison labor camps, So where prisoners are actually tortured, actually, that sort of thing, actually. I enjoy, my work a lot, but still, starting like I think 2017, when we had the assassination of a constitutional lawyer, Muslim lawyer, at the Yangon International Airport, I sensed that things were getting increasingly volatile, and then we had the so-called ultra-nationalist Buddhist movement, called Mabata. I never thought this was a spiritual movement or this was a religious movement. Actually, this was merely a political movement, campaign by the military, actually, that sort of thing. So, but no choice, actually, So we have to do what we want to do, actually. We were focusing our attention on the military interests, actually, etc. In 2019, I was attacked by a group of assailants, actually, I sustained a gunshot injury in my leg, actually, and then I felt pressure, actually, by my immediate family members, to quit the work, actually, and then I give them a choice, actually. I will give them temporary shelter, outside Myanmar, and then I will go back home actually, and do my work. But then I was caught up in the COVID lockdown in Australia 1 week after I arrived here in Melbourne. And then a few months later, I saw the first signs of coup actually, coming impending coup actually. And then I decided to wait, the power transfer after the elections, that sort of thing actually. And then we had the coup. And then I'm still actually in Australia and managing my newsroom from here.
So it's quite a story of determination, and then also being shot and having to exit the country and then getting stuck here in the middle of a global pandemic. We do hope that you can get back to Myanmar someday very soon. Peter Greste, I want to come back to you. I'm interested in your perspective on coverage of Southeast Asia. In my mind, it has dissipated even in the years since I was there. And I went to Cambodia in 2009 and came back to Australia in 2014. There was a big focus on Southeast Asia at that time. There was the red shirt situation in Thailand. Aung San Suu Kyi was released. Elections in Burma. There was a lot going on. And I feel like we're not seeing as much. And I'm wondering if you think that's right and why that is and how we correct that.
Look, Zoe, I don't have any objective numbers, but I don't think you have to be a particularly close observer of Australian media to recognise that the region has fallen off out of the pages of our newspapers and off our television screens, and I think that's deeply problematic. I think politically, we've lost a lot of the focus that we used to have. Our governments, the current government, seems to be much more interested in engaging with Europe, the United States, with the UK, and so on. We've lost a lot of political and diplomatic attention, I think, on the region, and that's given license. That's allowed a lot of news organisations to shift their focus accordingly. We've also seen, I think, a catastrophic loss of bureaus across the Asia-Pacific region. And I think that's bad. Now, that's happened for a number of reasons, of course. We know that news organisations are trying to save money wherever they can. We know that foreign news is both expensive and not particularly popular. And so, for all sorts of reasons of expediency, news organisations have closed down those bureaus, those networks. And I think that's tragic. We are a country, whether we like it or not, whatever we are culturally, we are anchored in the region. We need to be much more engaged in the Asia Pacific region. And I think we urgently need to start covering more thoroughly. That's, I think, partly a political choice, a strategic choice that a lot of news editors are going to have to make. I also think it's absolutely vital that we, as I mentioned earlier, that we do what we can to support local journalists, to support freelancers and citizen journalists, not just with space, but also with resources, with money. I think, Michelle, you were speaking earlier about the need for the vibrancy of poetry and literature in Myanmar. And I think the difficulty of keeping that alive if those people don't feel as though they're being heard. And I think this is a way that we, as news organisations, as media houses, can do what we can, ought to be doing what we can to support that. It's possible. It's quite evident that the way that the junta is targeting media, is targeting journalists, is the effect that has, that free media has on public opinion. They clearly see it as a significant threat, and I think supporting free media, supporting journalism, supporting literature is likely to really make a profound impact on the administration. How we do that, how we organise our news organisations, how we create the political pressure is a much harder thing to achieve. I just think we as within Australia, we need to be having some very difficult conversations about the importance of foreign coverage, because without it, we're simply not going to see the political pressure that we need on our governments to engage both actively and directly in these kinds of crises, and particularly when it comes to Myanmar.
And we have seen some steps in that direction via Judith Neilson Institute, for example, allocating money to Asia Pacific coverage, and indeed the Alliance for Journalist Freedom that you are representing has a role to play in terms of advocacy in that regard.
Yes, absolutely. And we've been speaking out very strongly, and we've been engaged on a number of fronts with journalists in Myanmar, both out of public eye, but also, we've been very publicly advocating for the freedom of Myanmar journalists. And it's abundantly clear that the crisis in Myanmar is without doubt one of the most serious for journalism. Certainly on a per capita basis, I think Myanmar is the world's greatest jailer of journalists. Back at, I think it was in December of 2020, Myanmar had only one record of a journalist who'd been imprisoned. Since the coup, we know of almost 100 who've been imprisoned or have been arrested. About half of those, I believe, are still behind bars, and that makes them easily one of the most significant jailers of journalists in the world, period. Now, how we need to keep advocating, we need to keep up the pressure. It's a long, hard slog without the flow of information coming out of that region. That's the challenge we're facing.
Michelle, I'll come back to you before we close with Swe Win. What can you add to that? What strategies do you think there might be for getting the spotlight on what's happening and broadening that conversation out internationally?
Well, before I talk about that, I just wanted to pick up on what Peter was saying about the importance of information and literature, but really what is available through that kind of writing, through, a report engenders opinion engenders conversation. You might have deeper engagement with that through poetry, through literature, but always with writing, with reporting, with information and knowledge. There's that constant thinking, the debating, the kind of deciding who we are and who we continue to be. And that's, true for Australia. It's also true in Myanmar. And I remember, really early on, it was very difficult in Myanmar to actually have a national conversation about identity. And after, during that period of quasi-democracy, that was an important conversation that people really wanted. And ironically, it took place through various advertising campaigns, people talking or being able to talk about national identity. And so I think, it's really important to pause and think, what is it that journalism, writing, that thing in our society does for us as a whole? It's super important because those complex things need to be considered at length and at leisure and with different depths of attention. So that's a really important thing that Peter's kind of raised, and Swe Win talked about it too, in terms of not being able to really look at the complex things that are going on. Sorry, the question again was how to continue with the process. We need to hear people. People need to know they're being heard. Artists, writers, journalists, citizen journalists, finding the platforms where those kind of cracks are appearing, where they're able to get stuff out, being aware of, when the internet's being pulled out of certain areas, and knowing that those people suddenly, lose this important communication. That is part of it, making sure you see people. And I think the Australian people are interested in this, and it's just about coverage and how you bring that coverage. One of the sad things about reporting during the worst years of the junta was that, Myanmar, Burma, was reduced to just one thing, democracy or not democracy. It's a complex country. So I think, that complexity and the way it's looked at is one way of kind of maybe engaging people more.
Swe Win, back to you for a final comment. I'm interested in who is reading Myanmar Now. What sorts of people are accessing the platform, and what strategies do you have to broaden that audience to increase the spotlight on what's going on in the country?
Yeah, we have about 1.5 to 2 million readers actually, visiting our website every month. Most of them, the majority of them, are from all different parts of the country actually, So they are bypassing the blockage. For example, our website has been blocked Facebook has been banned, which is the main platform actually for people inside the country. But it's very interesting. Many people are able to bypass all these blockages to access our website actually, So this is the that is the situation actually, So we are actually, we are receiving a lot of tests from many people inside the country, about actually, very serious situation, somebody being taken away, somebody being shot dead, etc. All these, we are overwhelmed, I will say actually, we are overwhelmed daily, with all these news actually. But, we try actually, not to get fatigued actually, with the news actually, So because it's important, it's very important to keep reporting on all these issues actually, So we also what we try is not we don't just report what's happening today actually, Every few weeks or so, we try to reflect what has happened actually, and then we try to give them a broader view of the major events in the society, trying to explain as much as we can the complexities on the ground. That sort of thing we are trying to do. But the best thing we are trying to do is we're trying to be professional actually, amid this chaos. You can easily exaggerate, or you can easily, self censor actually, in this volatile situation, So because you are working in a situation where there is no jurisdiction for you actually, this is very difficult, and also this is very dangerous actually for any kind of professional work, So we are trying to be professional. We don't miss actually the fundamentals of the journalism. I think this is the most important aspect of our work. So that's what we are trying to do actually.
We thank all of you for your time today. I'd like to thank our panel, Swe Win, who's the editor-in-chief at Myanmar Now, Dr. Michelle Aung Thin, who's an academic and writer who teaches in the School of Media and Communication at RMIT University in Melbourne, and journalist Professor Peter Greste from the Alliance for Journalist Freedom and the UNESCO Chair in Journalism and Communication at the University of Queensland. Thank you so much to our hosts, the Wheeler Centre, Amnesty International and Free Media Myanmar, and thank you so much to you for taking an interest in this important subject. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and around the world.